Welcome. As we approach this hour, I want to introduce us to you. This is the Black Powder Podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Matthews, the only real libertarian that has ever existed in the history of mankind. And this is the Black Powder Podcast, of course, the only real libertarian podcast that is the only libertarian podcast that has ever existed in the history of mankind. And today, I am joined as usual by my co-host, the Honorable Tub from Jacksonville, Florida. How you doing tonight, Tub?
I'm somewhat surprised. First, the dramatic pause that you had in the intro. It's like you forgot where you were for a brief second there. And then also now, honorable?
Honorable. It's 2025. I'm trying to improve myself and be nicer to those less fortunate than me, especially in physical appearance.
You're in California. There is nobody less fortunate than you. So with that, I appreciate it. And thank you for having me on once again.
Yeah. Anyway, now that we got our special needs host out of the way, Eric, how you doing? Eric,
you just said that you were going to be nice because you're trying something new, and it lasted all of 6 seconds.
It didn't last. I'm sorry. It was just when I heard you speak and I looked at your face while you were speaking, I lost all hope I could improve myself in the moment.
Eric, this is my last show.
Eric Parker, Bold Liberty, out of the great state of North Carolina. How you doing this fine evening?
I'm doing good. This morning it was 18 degrees on the drive to work, so as a former Floridian, I'm not really used to this. And we're about to be getting some snow tomorrow, apparently, so that's kind of new. So yeah, I'm excited. New things happening in 2025.
18 degrees is amazing to me, but I'm sure our guest, Eric Brakey from the Free State Project, I'm sure 18 degrees is no big deal to him, being in one of the most northernmost states, right below Maine, the great state of New Hampshire now, right? You're no longer in Maine, correct?
That's right, though I still I brought all my LL Bean flannels over with me, and so I'm very much prepared for the cold weather we're having. Though, despite what people say about New Hampshire, we have not gotten any real snow, at least where I am in southern New Hampshire. So it's very cold. We've had like 20 degrees out, weather, but no snow, real snow so far, except for a little dusting on Christmas, which was nice.
That's amazing. I have seen snow before, mainly on TV, but it still amazes me that ice falls out of the sky.
You gotta fix the antenna there. If you're just getting snow on the TV, you've gotta adjust the antenna.
Well, I still only watch UHF channels because I'm a public television guy, and I want to send a message to all the politicians talking about cutting public television funds in the upcoming budget, the Doge guys. If you do that, we're going to have some serious problems because Nova and Nature raised me. And those two shows deserve to be passed on to the future generations. So that's my little message.
Non-libertarian take of the show.
Yeah, I think you got to drop that real libertarian thing.
I was just getting ready to say that. There's so much for the only real libertarian.
Okay. So now I'm getting teamed up on by
the guests and the ghosts.
The guests. The guest goes, dude, you're so wrong.
No, but there's a common denominator. There's a common denominator between everybody but me in this little chat here.
We're informed.
Okay. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Whatever you're doing, this is the Black Powder Podcast. We're going to get started with Eric Brakey, but before we get started, I want to give a little message to my peoples. I'm here in, it was sunny today here in Southern California. Also, not as windy as it was the 2 prior days. But there's some real destruction going on right now. And I want to take this time to tell my fellow Americans, now is not the time for politics. Now is not the time for BS. Just like it wasn't when those hurricanes were hitting Florida and North Carolina. We we shouldn't be focused on bullshit right now. We shouldn't be focused on politics. If your chosen politician is blaming people while their fellow Americans are suffering, you need to take a step back and really evaluate your choices for the leadership in this country. Because I don't think there's a time and place for everything, but I don't think the time nor the place when people are in the middle of suffering is the time to dissect the many political problems that we have here in America. Now is the time, if you call yourself a Christian, if you call yourself a person of a good heart, if you call yourself any kind of moral individual, now is the time. If you want to do anything, how can I help those less fortunate than me? You know, that's what I want to say to my fellow Americans tonight, being here in California. I don't have any skin in the game. I'm far enough away from these disasters, but I don't like hearing the rhetoric that's going on right now, because this is, aside from somebody getting murdered in your family, nothing's worse than losing your house and all your possessions. That's one of the most basic fundamental things an American can have, is their property and personal belongings. And with that being said, Eric, how you doing?
Well, that's a real somber note to follow. I suppose I'm counting my blessings over here. Up in the Northeast, we get snow, but I often feel grateful that we don't really get hurricanes, we don't get wildfires, we don't get earthquakes, we don't get all these other tornadoes, all these other ways that nature is trying to kill us all the time. I don't mean to say that flippantly.
No, not at all.
I have a brother who was out in California for a long time. Thankfully, he moved out, and he's not there with his family. But it's one thing on the other side of the country. It's you see it on TV, and it's kind of like it's an idea of something that's happening over there. But for you, kind of, I know you said you're 20 miles away from it. I'm sure there's a lot of people you personally know who are directly affected by this, and I can only imagine what that's like.
Yeah. Tub or Eric, I didn't want to leave you guys out of that. Did you guys have, because you both, well, Tub didn't reach out to me. Eric did reach out to me to see how I was doing yesterday. Yesterday I was at Disneyland.
That's honestly, good that you were able to enjoy time with your family.
I don't think people understand the scope of California. Like, California goes, if you put it on the East Coast perspective, California would be from the Florida-Georgia line pretty much to New Hampshire as far as the coastline goes. And like where I live, there's about, with the 4-county area, there's roughly 15 to 18 million people, and it's spread out. It's a vast area. So when things affect Southern California, it is extremely regional. So you can be in an area of within, I'm within 30 miles of Los Angeles, but it's not affecting me because of how spread out we are and whatnot. Tub, I didn't mean to cut you off. Did you have any appropriate messages for the people of California?
Appropriate? No, I didn't. No. Well, the reason why I didn't reach out is because it was already in the group text, and you mentioned you're at Disneyland, so I'm like, oh, clearly he's doing fine, except for the Disneyland. But I was like, yeah, you're fine. But it's funny you mentioned that. So Eric, I'm originally from Connecticut. And so, like, when I moved down here in Florida, the thing that threw me off was kind of like what he's saying right there, is that if I drove for 5 hours from Connecticut, I can go through most of all New England, basically. You know what I'm saying? So I go through 4 states easily, and I get down here in Florida, and you're still in the state. In fact, in some aspects, you're still 5 hours away from the other end of it.
Yeah, I mean, I've visited California, but I've never lived there. It always seemed to me like it always seemed to me like it should really be broken up into multiple states, or at
Yeah.
least like the
It's
people
really
up north in the state of Jefferson deserve to be able to have some autonomy and self-determination there. So yeah, it's I don't know. I feel like I would just feel politically hopeless in California, just kind of knowing that it's so big population wise that no matter what I did, I couldn't really have any impact on state politics and the laws of the state. It just seems like so big and so out of your control. So
Well, I would ask: could you say that about all Americans? Essentially, because what if you live in a state like Texas, and you may not agree with conservative policies, implementing biblical aspects into public schools and all of that stuff? And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, because when you say you're the director of the Free State Project, the state should be free and free from party politics, special interest, and things of that nature. That's what I would assume a free state is, where, you know, this particular person's personal belief system isn't imposed on me via government interaction with me. Is that not correct? Am I off?
no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean that so maybe I should introduce the Free State Project.
Yeah,
I know I've been on once before, but it's been a while, right? It's been
March of last
March.
year.
All right. Well, we're almost coming up on a year, at least 10 months out. So for those who don't know, the Free State Project is a mass migration movement of libertarians to the live free or die state of New Hampshire. It's been going on for 22 years. Thousands of people have made the move. And over the course of the last 2 decades, we've built very robust and active libertarian communities around the state, as well as people have gotten very involved in politics. Obviously, that's, you know, many libertarians like to do that. And now a quarter of the state legislature are libertarians. New Hampshire has been ranked number 1 for freedom in America for several years in a row now, leading on school choice, tax abolition, Second Amendment rights, you know, almost any liberty issue under the sun. We've got some work to do on cannabis policy, but that's one we always get dinged for. But New Hampshire has kind of become a uniquely free state, and there's a strong kind of backbone of kind of challenging the federal government from the state legislature here. So, but to your point about a state like Texas or California, I agree on both. I lived in Texas for a year and a half. I certainly think I liked it more than I would have California, but certainly the prospect of when you live in a small state, you can have a much bigger impact on the kind of laws that you live under. I remember being involved in the constitutional carry effort in Texas when I was there. I helped with it after I had helped authored the constitutional carry law in Maine during my time in the Maine Senate. And, you know, in Maine, you know, I could just mobilize several thousand people to show up at the state house and contact their legislators. And that was enough to, like, you know, put the politicians on edge that they needed to restore people's rights with the Second Amendment. But in Texas, like, man, you got to like mobilize millions of people. It is these very large states. You need a lot more resources, a lot more. One person trying to make a difference with shoe leather isn't going to cut it. But in a small state like Maine or New Hampshire or many of the small states that dot our country, you can make a difference, and that's one of the reasons that New Hampshire was picked as a unique value prospect.
Oh no, my bad, Eric.
Well, Tub, do you have something?
No, I'm keep going because I got like 3 questions for me. Like just as he talks, I start thinking of these things. So go ahead and go first, and I'll jump in.
Yeah. So for those that don't know, you were previously a state senator in Maine, correct? I think.
Yeah, 3 terms.
3 terms in Maine, and I guess you term limited out, right? Or is that a thing there?
No, actually, term limits in Maine are 4 terms, and it's about consecutive terms. And I took a break for 4 years to run for federal office, so what my third term was technically was my first term for term limit's sake. So I could have done 3 more terms if I wanted to, but I decided
Gotcha.
it was it's been a decade of my life since the Ron Paul campaign in 2012, like doing politics in Maine, and I was ready for a new challenge.
Gotcha. So, what is how big is the political divide between Maine and New Hampshire? I know the population size is similar, and I guess
Yeah.
being effective with activism politically is probably a little similar. But what about the politics of the two?
Well, I think that they're very culturally similar, but it's like you ever think about, like, you think in your life, you go back and like the road not traveled, you could have gone left and instead you went right, and you wonder what it would have been like if you had taken one road instead of the other. That's kind of like Maine and New Hampshire. Like half a century ago, there was a decision that you know, whether or not to implement an income tax, and New Hampshire said no, and Maine said yes. And it has been kind of a huge kind of divergence in policy since then. Maine has become, over time, one of the highest tax states in America. I think it's right now ranked number 43 on the Freedom Index, and falling. It's facing huge budget deficits. Democrats are finally coming in and passing gun control laws, and Maine is sadly sliding into becoming just another New England state with all the terrible progressive New England policies that have destroyed so much of the rest of the region. But New Hampshire, I think partly because of how bad the states are around New Hampshire, there's been, and the presence of the Free State Project there's been, I think, a bit of a brain drain on the other states around, as kind of the libertarian and freedom-loving people of New England particularly, but also people from around the country and around the world have moved and concentrated in New Hampshire, and that's made all the difference. It's hard to kind of leave behind a state and people that you love and know that things don't look so great there in terms of the prospects for people's freedoms and paychecks. But I think that there is New Hampshire is something to contribute to the cause of liberty for the world if we can really establish New Hampshire as a unique laboratory of democracy for libertarian policies, where we can demonstrate that school choice works, gun rights works, all these liberty policies work. Then that's something that you can start to export to other states once there's a working model. And we haven't really had that in the libertarian movement for the longest time. We've been a scattered diaspora around the country, and you know, we may be like 5% wherever we are, but that's just not enough to affect the politics of the culture of a given state. But you concentrate people in New Hampshire, and it starts to make a difference.
So I have a follow-up question, only because you mentioned taxes in New Hampshire. There was previously a huge win for New Hampshire, correct? I think they abolished the income tax in the state, and they also don't have a sales tax. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, that's been kind of long standing, no income tax and no sales tax in New Hampshire. But there were some, even though they said there was no income tax, there was a little asterisk next to that. There were a few things. There was an interest and dividends tax, so tax on investment income, which ideally you want people investing, right? That's how you build an economy. And the libertarians, who are frankly in a lot of the Republican leadership positions in the legislature now, really led the charge to abolish that. So now there is truly no income tax in New Hampshire. There is no sales tax either. I think that makes New Hampshire and Alaska the only two states in the country that have no income tax and no sales tax. Now, Alaska is able to do that because they get a lot of money off of their oil industry that they use to fund government. New Hampshire just does it by actually cutting spending and having a very lean government.
So where does the state government get theft from?
Yeah, you got to steal from someone somewhere, right? So there's a few things. So property taxes are one of the taxes we do have in New Hampshire, though those are set on the local level. Nobody loves property taxes. I don't love property taxes. Frankly, the property taxes can be pretty high in some municipalities. But because that's kind of varies municipality, you get a lot of choice in terms of what property taxes you're paying based on where you choose to live. There are also a few other taxes, like a lot of states. New Hampshire likes to hit the tourists, so there's a meals and lodging tax. So if you are to come and visit New Hampshire, which we certainly encourage you to do, you will pay a tax on your hotel room and meals when you go to eat out. New Hampshire also has a state monopoly on liquor sales. So like any liquor store you go to is going to be a state operated liquor store. So that's a little statist, but I suppose I will take that over an income tax and a sales tax.
Isn't there a big, like a massive liquor store just over the state line?
Yeah, I don't know all the details of how it works out. I mean, for a state-run kind of model, I would say that the New Hampshire liquor stores actually do seem to bring in a lot of people who come specifically to buy their alcohol in New Hampshire.
Because there would be people actually leaving Massachusetts, intentionally going up into New Hampshire, and I'm like, are they not selling all that stuff in Massachusetts? Like, but I don't know if I don't know what their purpose was. I didn't get that far into it. But I remember people talk about that all the time, and I'm like, that just seems odd. All right, so is it my turn now, or Eric?
Go ahead.
People come to buy their smokes because the cigarette taxes are very low compared to all the other states.
Two quick statements with this. Now, one is, hey, let's hear it for self-inflicted term limits. Like, we need far more of that. We need far more people going, you know what? I think I'm done here. Let somebody else go give this thing a try, kind of like what you did. So we can find a way to make that happen. Also, in all reality, I wonder how many of us would say, hey, I'll keep paying property taxes if I don't have to pay sales taxes. You know, because I'm paying them anyway. And so, and the problem is many times as libertarians, we want that all or nothing mentality. And so, like, they'd be like, well, I don't want to pay no property taxes, and I don't want to pay any. And I'm the incrementalist guy. I'm kind of like, hey, can't we kind of take steps to get to that point? And it seems like you guys are kind of there. Now, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say too. I don't know. I don't think there's any state that's managed to figure out how to get rid of property taxes. I'd love to. I'd love for New Hampshire one day to be the first.
I have a plan.
Cubs got an idea.
And I might personally be willing to like pay sales tax if it meant getting rid of property taxes. I tend to find, at least a consumption tax is I've got some choice in the matter. But that anyway, no state has managed to pull that off. I always worry when they talk about like making the swap that you're just going to end up with both.
I want to point out this comment real quick by Joe. Terrible impression of me. Club is not a
I don't even know what reference he's referring to.
I don't even know what reference he's referring to, but I just feel like you're taking everybody's thunder.
Nobody wants to do an impression of Joe Hanu. So I want to make that abundantly clear. Nobody's trying to beat Joe. So Joe is all his own. You can't even try to imitate Joe. All right. So
I have no doubt about that. Yeah, go ahead.
So here's the thing. All right. So we understand the plan behind the Free State Project. The goal is to say, hey, come up here and let's see what we can do. Now, here's what happens. Let me ask you some. I'm 50 years old. So I'm going to ask you some 50-year-old man questions inside of this. Okay. So right. I got like 3 or 4. We'll get there. So the first one is this. So as you try to draw people in, what do they do when they get there? Like, what type of jobs can they get? Like, what are they looking to do? Because if I move, I'm talking about like I might be moving a family, and how am I going to take care of my? Just as I go and join this libertarian idea, doesn't mean I still don't have to feed my family and things. So how's that tend to work?
Yeah, well, those are kind of some of the practical questions every mover has to figure out, and we do make resources, and community is always there to help people kind of figure things out. So yeah, like the practical things are right. Housing. And I'll be honest, like it's so desirable to live in New Hampshire. Everyone wants to live here, and housing has become more and more expensive. So, I think that's actually a good case to move sooner rather than later, because I think we're working in the legislature to kind of do some zoning reform so we can build more housing. But finding housing can be a challenge for some folks. And what's that?
What about work?
And work. So it really depends on kind of your field and what you're looking for. If you're a skilled like tradesman, one great thing that New Hampshire has is we have reciprocity with occupational licenses from other states. So if you're and frankly, I think like a lot of places, New Hampshire has a shortage of a lot of skilled tradespeople. So if you were a skilled plumber or electrician or something like that, and you were to come to New Hampshire, I bet you would like make bank pretty quick. There's a high demand for folks, and your license will be recognized. So that's great. We get a lot of people who are we get a lot of tech people, IT folks, the kinds of folks who, New Hampshire, I think, ranks #1 in the country for internet connectivity. So a lot of people who have the jobs where they can work from anywhere, New Hampshire is a very desirable place for that. You're working for some corporation or something or another, and they say, they don't mind if you come into the office or not. Well, you might as well work from New Hampshire and be a part of the libertarian community. So there is I have found that in the Free State community, there is a disproportionate number of tech people and IT people. I think that's also partly why like the cryptocurrency scene is so big here in New Hampshire. It really kind of depends on what you're looking for. We've got some great firearms manufacturers in the state. So I know some folks come in, and that's sometimes those are good kind of first stepping stone jobs as you're kind of finding your way to live here. If you're like a political activist, oftentimes one great thing, and you want to get paid to do political work, the state chapter of Americans for Prosperity is basically run and operated by libertarians. The national level AFP is sometimes doing weird shit like endorsing Nikki Haley for president, but on the local level, at least certainly in New Hampshire, it's like there's basically like anarcho-capitalists who like run it, and they just like leave us alone. National level, stop making us look bad. We just want to be here to like pass school choice and get gun rights and pass right to work. Anyway, they're doing a lot of good work there, and they're always kind of looking to hire kind of good people. So, but really, I guess it depends on like what your field is and what you're looking for. The one thing you will absolutely find as you're exploring New Hampshire is that there is a very, very active and robust community that wants to help you figure these things out because we want you here. And
I think you guys started kind of getting a bad rap because when it was first kind of picking up a little bit, you would get what we might call questionable people that are just kind of moving up there with no goals and no directions in life. They was like, hey, we're just kind of hanging out and doing this. I think you guys kind of caught some heat from all that. Are you starting to see that kind of change now?
Well, there's a really great book by Malcolm Gladwell called The Tipping Point. I don't know if any of you guys have ever read The Tipping Point, but it's basically the idea like, the first people on a trend are always going to be like a little odd, right? It's like before something is totally mainstream. And look, I'm a little odd. I think we're all a little odd. We're libertarians, right? Where you got to be a little odd to like. So I don't say this in a dismissive or insulting way, but like the people who like said, hundreds of years ago, I'm going to leave Europe, hop on a ship and travel for 3 months. Like, yeah, that was a pretty odd decision to make. But you got to have, but it's the odd people, the people who are willing to step outside of the mainstream comforts are the ones who are the pioneers. And so, yeah, you could say that maybe about some of the early folks, but I think, at this point in time, I think the success of the movement has been very, very much demonstrated. I mean, the Republican House Majority Leader is a Free Stater who came as a part of the Free State Project. There are many business owners and entrepreneurs and people who are great community leaders. I mean, you look at how many folks are in the legislature who kind of come out of the Free State movement. These are people who've been elected by their own communities, and we're not just talking like it's just Free Staters electing Free Staters. These are people who've earned respect from their own kind of local communities of regular, many native Granite Staters. and they've been entrusted to lead and to represent them. So I think that that's a real testament to the quality of people that we have here. I've loved, as I got here, that it was kind of like New Hampshire was the land that the end of the Ron Paul campaign forgot. It was like it ended, 13 years ago, but nobody in New Hampshire got the memo, and they just kept building, kept growing. And so 22 years into this, we're like at the start of the second generation of the Free State movement. And I don't know. I think the results speak for themselves.
So do they have the ones who kind of show up there? Do they have a certain part of the state that they're going to? Do you find that there is a portion of the state, hey, you're better off to start here and maybe you kind of work your way around? Like,
maybe that would have been true in the past, but there's really kind of strong footholds of Free State communities in all different regions of the state. And every kind of community, the different communities in different regions have their own character. Manchester, which is our biggest city, tends to be a first stop for a lot of people. And there's a very strong kind of Free State community in Manchester. It's also where the first Liberty Clubhouse in the state, there's 6 now. But the Quill is in Manchester.
Hold on. I'm going to interrupt you. What is the Liberty Clubhouse?
So Liberty Clubhouses there's like 6 different Liberty Clubhouses. They're just like community centers for libertarians. That the Free State Project as an organization doesn't run, but people in the Free State community have over the years taken the initiative to start these clubhouses that are kind of community centers where different events take place. We plenty of like new mover potlucks. When new movers arrive, we kind of welcome everyone, get them connected to the community. They introduce themselves. We all have a fun time. All kinds of events. So that's all across the state. Now, I'm in the Seacoast region, which is about an hour away from Manchester, and there's a great community clubhouse in our area called The Shell. We often host like comedy nights. Robbie the Fire Bernstein comes up every year to do a comedy show at the Shell. You have up north in the North Country, which is kind of more rural. I would say the Free State community up there is much more conservatarian, if that's kind of your thing. Kind of those are the folks who they love liberty. They're libertarians, but they tend to be maybe a little bit more religious and Christian, and they're more into homesteading and kind of the more rural life. Not the kind of place you want to go if you're single looking to mingle.
Right.
But if you're want to raise a family and be connected with a great kind of community that promotes self-sufficiency, like the North Country is great. Then you kind of go out west towards Vermont. You've got Keene, New Hampshire, which has a very distinct community. The Keene libertarians tend to be kind of sometimes an infamous reputation. I think
they're weird. Excuse me. Let me interrupt you. Keene. I know people from Keene. They're weird individuals.
We're all libertarians. So.
No, but they're kind of like super weird. My bad, Eric, but I have.
I got nothing wrong with the weirds.
I don't either.
We're all a little weird, but no, but Keene is, well. First of all, I will say that right. It's the weird people who push things that other people aren't on board for yet, which is why Keene was for a long time, had become the Bitcoin capital of America. Keene, New Hampshire, you go back 10 years and this is where you saw some of the earliest adopters and promoters of Bitcoin was in Keene, New Hampshire. But you also have you have a lot of people who are interested in doing a lot more radical activism. This is where you saw I thought something that was actually really innovative, but I think maybe some people took it a step too far, which was this whole practice of Robin Hooding, which is basically you go around to the parking meters and you see the expired parking meters, and before the meter maid can get to them and give them a ticket, you put a quarter in the meter, and then you leave a little note on the car saying you've been saved by Robin Hood and his merry men from the king's tax collectors, and that was really great until I think maybe a few people took it a little too far and started filming themselves actively harassing the meter maids, and that got on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart. This was over a decade ago, And I just thought, boy, if you were making the meter maids seem like sympathetic figures, you've kind of screwed up somewhere. But
are you suggesting that libertarians took an idea and pushed it too far to where it's no longer effective? Because I find that very hard to believe.
Well, yeah, I think some people, right. So, some people can push things a little too far, and I think that sometimes we have to always be thinking about our activism as what are we doing for our own self-aggrandizement, and what are we doing to actually advance the cause and to win hearts and minds. So I thought kind of the initial concept of that was great for winning hearts and minds, and maybe a few people took it a little too far.
Yeah, that's kind of what people. So real quick, then, if I could shift gears for a second. Okay. So you ran in Maine as a Republican.
Yeah, I was I was a Republican state senator. Right. And I also ran for federal office twice. I was the Republican nominee for the United States Senate in 2018.
Was that merely strategic? Is that all that was, or what was the reason behind that? Instead of running as libertarian,
you can't win as a libertarian, right? So yeah. So I, actually, if you're curious, I did a big debate with Dave Smith several years back on whether the Ron Paul Liberty movement should pursue a political strategy in the Republican Party or in the Libertarian Party. And I argue very much, I don't see like political parties as inherently ideological vessels. I see them as, they're just like vehicles. They're cars. Like, use the car that's going to get you most effectively to where you need to go, to where you want to go. I wanted to be in a position that I could advance and fight for liberty, and running as a Republican was what allowed me to do that. If I ran as a Libertarian Party candidate, I would get 3% of the vote instead of 60% of the vote. And that's just the way the system is designed. It's not conducive to third parties. So, and I think Dave Smith actually came around over the years, and now will privately concede that I was right.
I'm one of those that are coming around to say that you're right, I guess, because I've always been the dude. If you're libertarian, run as libertarian, do the work. Sorry, it sucks, but if you are what you are, and be honest to it. And I've stuck by that. And then Eric and I, in particular, we ran for city council here in town in Jacksonville, and you can definitely see the advantages to saying, hey, you know what? The libertarian, we spent all of our time basically explaining the Libertarian Party to people, which, okay, fine, we're going to take that on. But that also, like I said, had all of its hindrances. So I'm kind of coming around now to the direction of, hey, you know what, maybe we have to run, in this case, Republican. Maybe we have to run Republican if we're really going to have a shot at actually winning, instead of just, because sometimes if you've been through it, you've seen that if you run as libertarian, you got a level of just being dismissed from the start. Like, you're going to get nowhere from the very beginning.
Right. And if you have the R next to your name, you're going to get 33% of the vote for just that.
Right? So would you suggest that maybe that's the new direction for libertarians? Like, hey, listen, if you're a candidate, like, great, stay in the party of liberty. If you're an activist or you're just voting and stuff along those lines, but if you're going to run, are you suggesting that, hey, maybe the new direction, it really is to run Republican, Democrat, whichever way you lean, that you run inside of that? And real quick, and I'll let you kind of answer these together, and then I'll pass this off to Marcus. If you are you considering running up in New Hampshire?
No, I'm not considering running in New Hampshire. I mean, okay. I'm still pretty young. I'm 36. I lose track. So I don't know, life's a long time, but I'm enjoying taking a break from that all for now. And I just got here. I do feel a little bit like it's presumptuous to just like move to a state and say, I'm running for office now. In Maine, at least, I had generations of family roots and anyway, but so no, I'm not planning anything like that currently. But I would say that is what I've been arguing for generally as a general strategy for the last decade, is using the Republican Party and wresting control of the Republican Party away from the neoconservatives. And I remember 10 years ago, people saying, because I was elected as a delegate to the Republican National Convention in 2012 for Ron Paul from Maine. I don't know if folks remember that, when the Maine delegates got kicked out of the convention. But many people after that like swore off and said, this Republican Party is so corrupt. I don't want anything to do with it. I'm leaving the party. It's like that didn't actually hurt our adversaries. Like, they were happy to see us go. Mm-hmm. Well, we were a threat to them, and to walk away leaves control of the party in their hands. My goal has been since 2012 was to wrest control of the party away from the neoconservatives, and I think that we are closer to that today than I think we have been a long time. And certainly, I think that we can see, kind of going to show that political parties are not like fixed in stone in terms of what they stand for. It depends on who's in the driver's seat, who's operating the machinery of it. I mean, certainly the Republican Party of today is very different than the Republican Party under George W. Bush. It's almost like a completely different party. And there's good and bad in that, right? I like that the party has shifted away from a lot of its more foreign policy, bellicosity, and imperialism. I don't necessarily like that it's shifted away from maybe some more free market positions that I agree with. But you kind of got to take the good with the bad, and you got to keep standing on your own principles and fighting for pushing in the right direction.
So I said I was done. I lied. Okay. So
Wow.
hey.
I had good stuff coming up too.
20 minutes left still. All right. So real quick then. So if people who come up, they say, hey, I want to run for office and stuff. Are you suggesting that they run inside Republican or Democrat parties for you guys up there?
Yeah, I mean, I would, if someone were to ask me for my advice, I would say that you want to run in one of the two major parties. I think that's the way to do it. So in New Hampshire, people tend to run as Republicans. There have been a few free state Democrats who've gotten elected, but I tend to find that we've seen that one of a few things happens. First of all, Joe, I see that. I don't think that buying land is imperialism. I think invading it is imperialism. So different things. But I'm no expert on what's being talked about there with Greenland. But what was I saying? Oh, but yeah. There have been a few free staters elected as Democrats, but the Democratic Party has been very. They hate free staters and they try to root us out. And so usually if someone gets elected, it lasts for a term, to where they're found out and they're drummed out of the party, or they get co-opted and they fall to the dark side. And groupthink is a very powerful thing. You send like a lone free stater into the Democratic caucus to stand on their own for liberty. And at a certain point, like you're surrounded by all these people and you want them to like you, and you can kind of like get seduced by it all. It's very, very, very hard. So.
Okay. This is to you, Eric, from that Liberty Lady. You can go ahead and.
So she says, so I guess all third parties can just go away, right? I don't know. Sounds like a pretty sarcastic question.
It might be
it's worded.
My co-hosts know her personally, so I'm going to let them interpret what she's trying to say.
I kind of had a question that goes along with that. Like, what do you think specifically the role of the Libertarian Party is within the conversation then? Should they ever run candidates? Should their candidates strictly be a mouthpiece for liberty, or should they not run candidates at all? Or should they run candidates to try to win elections if they're a political party?
Well, I think that the Libertarian Party can win in some local races. I think that there have been a few rare instances where Libertarian candidates have won state legislative races, but it's generally because one of the two major parties doesn't have a candidate in the race. I know that happened, I think, in Wyoming several years back. I think that third parties can run spoiler candidates, and I think that there is an important role for that. I think it's great to run a Libertarian candidate against Lindsey Graham, split the vote away from him. Use third party campaigns to drum out like the worst people. But also recognize that the Libertarian Party is not it. It's a tool. Use it for it's effective at doing. It is not effective at getting people elected because of the structure of the election system itself, where we have plurality-based first past the post voting that will always draw people in to a sense that they need to pick between the final two candidates. And if that's not the third party candidate, and 99 times out of 100, the third party candidate is not the person who is kind of in people's minds as like one of the final two choices, people have a tendency to vote for the lesser evil because they're more afraid of the greater evil that they perceive getting elected. And that's always going to be something that we run up against. And so where we have the opportunity to make political change is by running in the primaries, particularly in the Republican Party, in areas where Republicans can win. But maybe, I don't know, if you're in blue Democrat California, maybe it makes sense to run as a Democrat and run in the Democrat parties and emphasize civil liberties and cannabis and the things that we agree on there. But again, it's not to say that there's no role for the Libertarian Party. In fact, I know it's controversial to say in some circles, but I think what Angela McArdle has done has been a really innovative way to use the Libertarian Party, right? To use kind of the carrot and the stick approach, right? To use it as a negotiating leverage. Hey, we have a block of voters right here, and we can make or break you. We could be the difference between whether you get 50%, you could get above 50% or not. And the question is, here are our practical things that we want, and what are you going to give us?
Right. So in this podcast right now, we have two different segments, and we're doing this for legal and moral reasons. The first segment is Eric talking about the Free State Project, which we are currently in right now. The second segment will be Eric's personal opinions, which we have not covered yet. I have a question. Why does Upside Down New Hampshire play no role in the liberty movement? When I say Upside Down New Hampshire, if anybody knows their geography, you know I'm talking about Vermont. Is it the Bernie Sanders effect on Vermont? Is that why nobody ever talks about liberty in Vermont? Or is it like they're just concerned about maple syrup and beaver?
Well, there are some great liberty people in Vermont. Some of them have given up and moved to New Hampshire, and we're glad to have them. They're able to accomplish a lot more in New Hampshire. I think that Vermont is an interesting case study, right? And Vermont actually used to be the most conservative state in the union, right. And it changed. And it changed because there was at one point, they didn't call it this, but it was kind of like a socialist state project where socialists picked Vermont and they said, we're going to go move to Vermont and we're going to kind of concentrate there. And they turned the state socialist. And that's how Bernie Sanders came to Vermont. Like, he came as a part of that movement. He came out of New York and went to Vermont and ran for like the mayor of Burlington multiple times and was a perpetual loser until he won. And then he kept going and then piling up victories until he became the U.S. senator and like the icon for socialism in America. New Hampshire, I think, is doing that in the other direction, right? We're going towards liberty instead of towards total statism. But I think that the trajectory is similar. We are taking over the state legislature from the bottom up. And I imagine in this, on a long enough timeline, you're going to see eventually that the libertarian, equivalent of Bernie Sanders will one day be in the U.S. Senate from New Hampshire.
So, speaking of perpetual losers, what are your thoughts on Jeremy Kaufman?
Who's that? Oh, explain. I don't know.
Just kidding.
Who's Jeremy? I don't know.
Is that his name?
I have my disagreements with Jeremy, but I get along fine with him. I try not to pick fights, and I try to. I know Jeremy does pick fights. that's part of his thing, right? We operate a little bit differently, but look, Jeremy is one individual with a loud voice in the Free State movement, but it's also a big tent movement. This is the thing: is that in New Hampshire, the libertarian movement is so big that you will find libertarians that you hate and libertarians that you love, and whatever kind of libertarian you are, you will find that community here, and you will also find the people that you say, I don't like their brand of libertarianism. I don't want to associate with them. And that's fine, right? There are plenty of people here who you will want to associate with.
So the last segment of the Free State Project, Eric, part is what's new with their Free State project, and what do you guys got going on before we get into Eric Brakey's personal opinion segment?
I do think I shared some of my personal opinions along the way, but what I would say is we are preparing for some of our big annual events that take place that are taking place the next couple of months. Of course, the big one is in June. Everyone knows about the Porcupine Freedom Festival, and if you haven't been, Marcus, have you been?
No.
All right, then you need to take that real libertarian thing off, right? You're not a real libertarian if you've never been to Pork Fest. So we got to get you there this year, and we'll get you your credentials, checked out so you can.
Could you get this podcast a 1 hour segment where we show up and live stream from Pork Fest? Could you hook that up?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There are podcasters who come out and do their shows from Pork Fest all the time.
I mean, DL's gone up the past 2 or 3 times, but I don't think he's done I don't think he's done a show while he was there, though. Right?
Well,
when DL's gone up, I don't think he's done a show. So are you? Are we sitting here saying we're going to Pork Fest?
There's a high probability.
What? Mark is going to Pork Fest? I've never been.
I've never been that far north in America, and I'm kind of nervous about it because I don't know if I actually want to travel to 90% tub people with tub.
Those aren't people.
Huh?
They are.
Yeah, they're tubbish, and that kind of like concerns me. But
you just mean white?
Yeah, just say what it is.
White people?
White.
Well, the only state I never traveled to without my Glock 21 SF is New York, because you can get arrested walking through the airport with your checked luggage because you didn't get a New York State pistol permit. But everywhere else.
So let's ask that question, Eric. So if we come up to Pork Fest, how gun friendly are we there?
Everyone's strapped at Pork Fest.
Yeah, that's what I'm
people
saying.
Out of state also.
What's that?
People out of state also.
Yeah. I mean, there's probably more guns per capita at Pork Fest than probably almost any other place you'll find in the world. And there's never been a firearm incident. Interestingly enough.
No, I'm not.
It's like guns don't shoot themselves off, right?
Yeah, I'm not trying to take a pistol there to do anything. I'm just concerned about.
It would be a dumb place for anyone to do anything because everyone can defend themselves.
I'm just concerned about the tubs of the world.
So listen. So hold on. Maybe you're best not to. Because you're saying, hey, listen. I don't know how I feel about those white people. I'm bringing my gun. So trying to start problems.
I'm just talking about the tubs of the world.
And they're like, hey, the big black guy. Watch the big black guy. He's the one who was on. He was the one on that show talking about bringing his gun up here to us. So
Eric, I just want to state this fact to Eric real quick. That tub is my DEI hire. Because this is the Black Powder podcast is my creation, and I wanted to bring Tub on to make a lot of Americans comfortable with what the message I'm trying to bring to them, and I feel Tub brings that inbred, that Bronco. He brings that Bronco message.
I bring your rating.
It brings that old white Christian ratings.
Yes, listen,
he brings the Bronco evangelical audience to us.
And you bring the gunkle.
Anyways,
all right.
I do have a serious question, though. I know we're trying to switch gears, but seriously, if you're going to fly to New Hampshire with a firearm, I've never flown with a firearm.
You just got to declare
it. Declare it. You put it in your check. You put it in your check bag. Avoid going through New York if you can.
Yes, you need to avoid New York and New Jersey. Because those are two states where just the simple fact that you have a firearm could prove. There was a gentleman that was driving through New York from I think he was from Pennsylvania. He's still locked up because of the New York Safe Act. And he was traveling. And his stuff has gone to a federal case. I forgot the guy's name. He's the black dude, too. But he was traveling through New York on I believe it was I-95, and they pulled him over and he had a pistol and they wrapped him up under the New York Safe Act. And his intent was not to stay in New York. But the simple fact that you travel through New York without a New York gun permit or pistol permit, which takes about a year and a half to get, you will face multiple years in prison. It's not a misdemeanor. It's 10 plus years.
Yeah,
New
York is
the other day
ranked
I spent
number
over an
50
hour.
for freedom in America, the
What's that?
Empire State. New York, on the Freedom in the 50 States Index, New York is ranked number 50. It's dead last. It is the Empire
California,
State.
49.
I want to start a petition to get the Statue of Liberty moved up to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, because she doesn't fit in down there.
Technically, the Statue of Liberty is actually in New Jersey, but that's not much.
She doesn't fit in New Jersey
No,
either.
it's not much of a difference either.
Yeah.
Listen,
Yeah.
The other day I just spent over an hour reading through all the things you have to do in order to check a gun to travel, and then because I'm going to Connecticut on Sunday, and I'm going through it, I'm looking through all of it, and then I think I mentioned last week, I said I sent a thing in because you can get a temporary concealed carry permit in Connecticut. So I'm like, okay, I'll just get a temporary concealed carry. And then finally, after following up with them a couple of times, they finally answered like, oh yeah, that takes at least 5 months to get done. And I was just like, and then I'm like, you know what? Because then you scared me last week, Marcus, in many ways, but this way in particular, when you said that we're going to New York and it's from the start, it's a bad issue. And I'm like, you know what? I'm leaving it here. I'm going to go up to Connecticut without it just because I don't want to.
That's the first time Tubbs left his concealed anywhere.
And you know this for real.
Are you flying into New York? Because this past summer I went to Wisconsin, and this is something I felt entirely guilty about. I travel with my firearm as much as possible. When I went to Texas, I had it. It was a couple other states I had it. I went to Wisconsin. Those were the nicest people I've ever met in my entire life. And I felt like crap that I brought a 45 caliber pistol there in case somebody got nutty with me. And that was the furthest thing from anything that I would have ever encountered. But leaving out of LAX, Los Angeles International Airport, you go up to the check-in counter, declare your firearm. They're going to give you a little card to fill out, and you place it on top of your firearm in a TSA-approved case in your checked luggage, and it's really not a big deal. Long as you declare and you're forthright about it, and that's what I hate about America, because the government makes you do a lot of steps to defend yourself and declare yourself a free citizen of this country. But as long as you avoid, you wouldn't even have those problems in California that you would have in New Jersey or New York. Because California, you could fly from Florida with a checked firearm. I strongly suggest you do not bring magazines over 10 rounds. But I don't even think they're going to check with that. And then there's a lot of municipalities that aren't going to necessarily go after you if they do find you with a magazine over 10 rounds here in California. But as long as you follow the federal guidelines, you should be okay, except in the is that the Mid-Atlantic, New York and New Jersey? Do you call that Mid-Atlantic, or is that still New England?
That's not New England.
Okay, so it's the Upper Atlantic, or I don't know what you call that.
I would call it maybe the Upper Atlantic, usually, because usually you say Mid-Atlantic, you're shoving down into
Northeast,
like Virginia,
Northeast,
like that.
Yeah. The Northeast.
All right, so here's the thing. So why should we come to Pork Fest? And when I say we, I mean anybody.
Well, because Pork Fest is a unique experience. So it is a week-long libertarian camping festival under the White Mountains. It is kind of like it's kind of like a pop-up anarchist libertarian society for a week, right? You might go to like other conferences. You might go to, I don't know, maybe go to Freedom Fest or Anarchapulco or something. Those are conferences. Those are great. Hey, we have our own conference, right? We're doing the New Hampshire Liberty Forum in April. That's going to be great. But there's nothing quite like the Porcupine Freedom Festival, where you get to actually experience what like an autonomous, like free society is actually like for a week. It's not just, we have the speakers, we have kind of the fun activities, but we also have like a lot of the value of Pork Fest is that like the campgrounds become like a whole village, right? And people are setting up their own individual hubs. People are setting up their own shops and stores. People are selling things that are totally legal, and sometimes things that you wouldn't maybe legally be allowed to sell outside of PorkFest. Nothing that violates the non-aggression principle. Let me be very clear on that. But it is they call it, some people called it the libertarian Burning Man, right? It's an experience unlike exists anywhere else in the libertarian movement.
So I've heard things about PorkFest, and I hear all different, depending on what you're going for is kind of what you'll get out of it. I think the way it sounds, you know what I'm saying? But here's my question. I don't camp. So what are the other options? What are lodging options?
Yeah.
Wow.
I personally like to stay in a tent on the campgrounds, but not everyone wants to.
That's not my world.
Yeah, that's fine. There is a motel right there on the campground. Many people stay at. There are some nicer hotels that are within very clear near driving distance. Sometimes some of our bigger speakers who come out will stay in one of the nice hotels in the area. There's Airbnbs in the area. Also on the campgrounds, you can there are tenting sites, but there are also RV sites. Some people come out with their RVs. There's also some people purchase there's these little housing units on the campgrounds that they have access to year round. So people do a wide variety of things, but for that single week, the campgrounds become kind of like the liberty capital of the world.
And about how many people usually show
up? It's varied from year to year. Typically always have more than 1,000. Sometimes several thousand. I know that 2023 was a high watermark year when we had, PorkFest has grown over the years to the point where we're getting major presidential candidates who are coming by to try to court the libertarian vote. In 2023, we had Vivek Ramaswamy and also Robert F. Kennedy Jr. came out. When it's not presidential races, they don't show up as much. It's become kind of a real destination, and it's one of those things there where I think it's such a unique experience. Again, if you haven't been there, I want to call your libertarian card into question.
The only real one
be on your checklist of becoming a real libertarian.
You're the only real libertarian in this podcast.
I will not be questioned. I will not be questioned on this podcast about my libertarian credentials. That will not happen, my good sirs. I will fight for that. Okay, so we're done with the Free State Project segment of this podcast. As we begin to wrap this up, we want to start getting Eric Brakey's personal opinions on certain matters. And I will start this off. I have 2 questions for you. First question, where do you see America post January 20th, 2025? That's my first question.
Well, obviously, some things are shifting in good ways. Other things, I don't know. Some things are going to stay the same. Some things are going to get worse. I'm very intrigued by the prospect of Tulsi Gabbard as the director of national intelligence, if she can get through the confirmation process. I think that's one of the most important cabinet appointments that has been made. And I'll say I recognize that Tulsi Gabbard is not a real libertarian. As we all know, there's only one. Only one of us has been to PorkFest, so though Tulsi has been to PorkFest, so maybe she's more of a real libertarian than all of you guys. No, but I think, considering what we have seen of the abuse of power by these intelligence agencies over the course of, my whole lifetime, and going back further, though it seems to get worse and worse as time goes on, or at least we can see it better. It's harder for them to hide the evil stuff that they do. I think that her in that role, as someone who has demonstrated a certain degree of moral courage to challenge some of the orthodoxies around some of the wars, not all of the wars. Again, she's not a libertarian. I'm not going to say she's perfect, but so I'd be very curious to see how that plays out. I'm excited to see that, and I'm hoping that we will be shifting at least to some degree towards a more sane foreign policy, a less neoconservative foreign policy. Again, I know, and I already know based on some of the comments I saw that I saw one guy saying, well, they're just imperialists too. It's like, well, there's degrees, right? I would, Trump and the people around him, certainly, and there are neoconservatives around him, and that does concern me quite a bit. But he is not a neoconservative. He does not seem to have a clear principled worldview either. He seems very influenceable, which is why I want kind of libertarians in his orbit as much as possible to influence him in the right direction on foreign policy. I think that, it's like, it was amazing to watch in his first term, like, we're all ramping up towards a war with Iran, and then Rand Paul goes golfing with him, and he comes back saying, boy, maybe that's not a good idea, right? I want more Rand Pauls. I want more libertarians going golfing with him and pushing him in the right direction, because I think that is the best thing and the worst thing about Donald Trump is how influenceable he is on a lot of these major things. And so it's who's around him. So I don't know. Donald Trump is always a wild card. I don't know what to expect there, but truth be told, will the national debt be higher or lower in 4 years? Yeah, it's going to be higher. Yeah, I have no illusion about that. The spending is going to continue. I mean, maybe we'll see Doge with Elon and Vivek come to something. That would be great to see. But I think it's positive that we're talking about spending again, which we haven't really in earnest since the Tea Party days, and it's so much worse now than it was before. And certainly, yeah, Trump was just as much a part of the overspending as Biden and the Democrats and the Republicans, right? The Republicans have shown us, at least on the federal level, they're only fiscally conservative when they don't have the power to cut spending because they're in the minority. So yeah, the spending's going to be worse. The national debt's going to be worse. If I were a betting man, I would say that's the case, which is why we should be planning for a dollar collapse, and we should be investing in gold, silver, and Bitcoin and bullets. So yeah, on the national level, I don't have a lot of optimism for things on the national level. There are little victories to celebrate about, but I think the path to saving our country, or at least saving the people who live in our country, whatever our government looks like on the national level in the future, it's going to happen through the state legislatures. I think that's where the real fight is. And people get distracted all the time by what's going on in the carnival in Washington, D.C. When you get libertarians elected to the state legislature, which we have been very successful at, not just in New Hampshire, but around the country, running as Republicans for the most part and getting elected as Republicans, that if you get people, principal libertarians in the state legislatures who are willing to use the power of the states to nullify the federal government, whether it's cannabis policy or defend the guard to bring our troops home from undeclared wars, or nullifying gun control initiatives, or trying to tackle, I've got some ideas around tax nullification I'm going to be presenting at the New Hampshire Liberty Forum. I think that's how you fix the problem in Washington, D.C. It's not sending people into the belly of the beast who are going to change it from the inside. It's going to be eroding the support structures that prop up this imperial state, and that's using nullification, like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison laid out in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions.
So my second part of that question, my second part question to you, is about the LPNH. Now, they posted something a few weeks back after the Luigi incident in New York, where they said, if you have cancer and you don't have insurance, you deserve to die. And I found a grand offense to that statement. And I told them, I think you will come to regret that. And don't get me wrong, I'm a capitalist through and through, and there is no human labor that is, a human right to another. My labor is not your right or your right to live or anything like that. But as libertarians, how can we move this party forward when we have a now state party that says cancer touches a lot of people? I don't think there is a American alive where cancer hasn't touched their family. And when you say things like that, and people read when you say things like that, how do we move the party out of this radical? Well, what's weird to me is people love radical Democrats. They love radical Republicans because with gerrymandering, you know, you're subject to where the politicians pick the voters. You're subject to when they're picking conservative voters. How do you out conservative a conservative? And when you pick libertarian voters, how do you liberal voters? How do you out liberal a liberal? You have to go to the extreme right or the extreme left. But when we have a libertarian who we want to be the voice of reason saying that if you have cancer and you can't afford health care, you deserve to die. How do we sell our message going forward when you have people like that? And they're unapologetic. They endorse Trump. They have a very rightward lurch that, I've tried to reach out to black voters and tell them that we don't have a home with Democrats. We honestly don't, because they have not done shit for us. But we don't have a home with Republicans because they are the war on drugs, pro-policing people, where we have problems with our communities and the way the government interacts with our communities. I feel that black people are naturally libertarians because we know the government is effed up, and we know they don't do nothing for us, and we know they stand in our way, and we know that government is not our friend. Black people, speaking for black people, we're naturally libertarians. We just don't know it yet, but we have to overcome that barrier where, it's Democrat because the Republicans just don't offer us a message. And when you have the people at the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire talking that craziness that they do talk, how am I supposed to preach the message of liberty to people when if they start digging deeper, they're going to come across stuff like the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire?
Well, first of all, I will say there's a couple things to unpack there. First of all, you said, how does the Libertarian Party succeed? And I recognize that perhaps you and some of your audience cares if the Libertarian Party succeeds or not. But yeah, I care whether the Libertarian movement succeeds. And the Libertarian Party is incidental to that in my mind. Maybe it can be a valuable tool to help the Libertarian movement succeed, or maybe sometimes it's a hindrance. But ultimately, I care about, the ideas in the movement. As far as like LPNH, and again, I'll say, they intentionally seek to be offensive, right? That is part of their messaging strategy. You'd have to ask that. I couldn't explain to you kind of their strategy. I'm not involved in it. I don't. I know some of the folks there, but I don't. But I have no real connection to LPNH beyond kind of knowing some of the folks there, and I don't even necessarily know like who puts out the tweets. I know that there's like a couple of different people, and I think that oftentimes things are attributed to Jeremy that may not even have come from Jeremy. It came from someone else. I have no idea. But what I will say is that in New Hampshire, it's like, the reason why I think some of the more like the people who are doing kind of the more kind of triangulation messaging that's can win over people in the middle aren't in the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire, and why you have some of the most disagreeable people who seek to be offensive who are out there doing that is because like the libertarians who can actually like win things and want to win things are in the Republican Party, and they're winning things, right? We've got 93 elected libertarians in the state legislature. Some of them actually are like Libertarian Party members, but who run as Republicans and get elected as Republicans. So again, LPNH, like some people like that kind of the kind of intentionally provocative and saying things in the most offensive way. And certainly it does kind of like work the algorithm, and they've gotten a lot of attention for that. And I think, and they would argue that their strategy is working in that regard. Working to what ends, though, I think is kind of the question, like, what is the end goal you're trying to get there? And again, they'd have to answer that. I can't answer that for them. All I can do is I am trying to bring all kinds of libertarians to New Hampshire, whether they're right-wing libertarians, left-wing libertarians, whether they're as long as we kind of agree on the non-aggression principle. All the people who are always fighting and yelling about like who's the real libertarian and what's the real brand of libertarianism, they're yelling at each other on Twitter about it. I want them to come to New Hampshire and yell at each other's faces about it. We can all yell like in person and have, I would much rather, like, we can all fight about it once we're here and we are building something. And I stay away from a lot of the online Twitter drama myself.
I appreciate you in that regard, and that was one of the reasons I reached out to you, because you were struck me as one of my favorite guests. Both of these individuals that are my co-hosts were at one point guests on this podcast. Tub was probably top 150, was somewhere in the lower 140s, 150. Eric is up there, but when I was thinking about it, and I was like, I need to reach out to Eric. It was like after the election, I was like, where are we going as Americans? Where we decided to do the same thing that failed. Joe Biden, obvious failure, and Kamala Harris would be an extension of that failure. But this is my personal opinion, America, but I think Americans are stupid for trying to recreate something in a different light, because Trump's last year and a half was a complete disaster. And there's no way you could sum that up any other way. He was coming off, Obama had a relatively mediocre landing from the George Bush recession and the Great Recession of 2006, 7, and 8, 9. And we started, as all economies do after that type of stuff, there is nothing more than recovery. If it went any further, it would just be the destruction of the entire world as far as economically goes. It was going in the right direction, and Trump was riding that. But if it wasn't for COVID, Trump would have easily got reelected. There was no question about that, because there was nothing upsetting America. And then we had this COVID, and his response to it was, I'm going to do warp speed. And he bragged about shutting down the country. And everybody likes to reinvent history here, but the whole country, except for a few upper Midwest states, completely shut down. And it didn't matter what brand you were with. It happened under Democrats and Republicans. Some was more extreme than the other. But, I don't know why Americans don't understand where the buck stops. The buck has to stop with somebody. If you're going to call yourself the leader of the free world, doesn't the buck have to stop with you, and you take responsibility for what happens under your tutelage or whatever?
Yeah, certainly. I would say, though, I think that once we get to this level of like the presidency, very rare is the Ron Paul figure who comes along, who you can like feel like, man, I am voting for like an actual like good person who understands the right things and is right, and this can actually be like the avatar of like what I believe.
Right.
Oftentimes, usually, you are stuck picking between monsters, and but some monsters are created differently. Like, I think everyone at that level, for the most part, has blood on their hands in some way, shape, or form. I mean, I voted for Donald Trump this go around. I did that knowing that like he committed war crimes in Yemen. I did that knowing that he did royally screw up right? In COVID. I did that knowing that he ran up the debt and the deficit, and that he said that Thomas Massey needed to be thrown out of the Republican Party, like all of these terrible blemishes on his record. And yet at the same time, I recognized in him at least a certain there's a disruptiveness that is so sorely needed, where this just entrenched neoconservative, neoliberal stasis we've been in for my entire life. He's like the first rogue element to come along to inject a little bit of chaos into that situation and create the possibility of some kind of change. Now, on the federal level, like the only positive change I ever hope for is change on the margins. Again, I don't expect anyone is going to come in on a white horse and ride in and save us on the federal level. I think that we can save ourselves through the state legislatures. That's where I believe our focus should be. But with Trump, it's going to be a real mixed bag. Maybe there'll be some things he does worse than what Kamala Harris or the Democrats would have done. But some of the major issues, particularly around war, when World War III is kind of like a real thing, and I saw the trajectory that we were on with in Russia and Ukraine, and like at least Trump says something different. We'll see what he does now that he's got the opportunity. But having, I don't know, some voices around him like Tulsi and RFK and folks, that maybe there is a. I'm not saying we're not going to all die in nuclear hellfire in World War III. Maybe Trump delivers that outcome to us the same way that a Kamala Harris or a Joe Biden would have, but I do see at least more of an opening to try to get off that track than we would have been on otherwise.
Okay, so before we're gonna start wrapping this up real quick, but I want to introduce one last segment because you brought up something that truly intrigues me, and that's Ukraine, and that's how Putin became less of an enemy. But I want to ask anybody who has been following this, what do they think about appeasement? Because that's effectively what this is, and I'm not saying Putin is Hitler, but there's some striking parallels. When Hitler started, he just wanted the German-speaking segment of Czechoslovakia. He was like, these are our people. They need to be returned to us. And Europeans was like, okay, that's cool. And that's what Russia did with the borderlands of Ukraine, because they're Russian-speaking people. And that's going back to 2014, 2015, 2016, when all of that stuff started going on. How did Putin become a less of a threat to civil society more recently with his actions? How did we non-vilify this guy whose political opponents magically fall out of windows or ingest subatomic radioactive particles in their tea? How did he become an individual that was acceptable to what we know as Western society?
Well, I don't know that he's acceptable. I mean, I don't think of any world leader as acceptable. Again, I think that they're all blood-soaked monsters. I don't think you rise to that level in world politics without having a lot of blood on your hands, whether you're a leader of the United States, a leader of Russia, a leader of any world power, Xi Jinping. But first of all, I'll say, because I know that, I don't know how much time we have, but if someone wants to really know what I think, I gave a speech in the main Senate on Russia and Ukraine when they were filing a resolution on this, and I was a dissenting voice on it. It's the top pinned video on my X profile at Senator Brakey. It's gotten millions of views around the world. But you mentioned appeasement, and I certainly hear that a lot. People say, well, if there aren't consequences for what Russia does, then they're just going to keep going and keep going. But you know what? I bet you in Russia, they could tell themselves a very similar story of appeasement in terms of what they've allowed NATO to do over the decades since the end of the Cold War, right? Where we had an agreement with the Russians, that in exchange for them allowing us to reunify Germany under NATO, that NATO would not extend 1 inch east of the German border. And yet, starting in the Clinton administration, like, we broke that agreement. We started bringing in former Soviet satellite nations, which I get why they want to be a part of NATO, but this is not in our interest. Moving our military alliance closer and closer to the Russian border in an escalatory fashion that could provoke some real concerns. Just like we know we were concerned when Soviet missiles were in Cuba. Like, we don't want missiles like right off our shore pointed at us, and the Russians are in a similar position. Like, they're like, I always think about Ron Paul's like what if speech. He was talking about like, what if, always we need to imagine, what if the roles were reversed? What if the same things, what if we were in the shoes of the other country that we are building these narratives against? What if after the Cold War, it was the Soviet Union that won the Cold War, and NATO collapsed, and the Warsaw Pact still existed today, and it has been expanding. Now they tell us there's nothing to worry about because the Warsaw Pact is a defensive military alliance as they perform color revolutions in Central America, overthrow governments that are friendly to us, and install puppet governments that are friendly to them as they invade sovereign countries in the Middle East. And let's imagine like we're at the point where it's like they're talking about Mexico joining the Warsaw Pact. Like, what do we honestly think that like the United States would do in that case? Like, on the one hand, it's like certainly it wouldn't be appropriate for the United States to invade Mexico over that, but that we would, because we would consider it to be a real legitimate security threat,
right?
To have Russian military on our border like that.
History.
I've often suggested that the Russia-Ukraine issue, I said, and it's going to sound, it's very simple in the way I explain it. I said, but you got to understand this. Putin is a bully. We got that. Okay. So Putin is the bully on the playground that's over in the corner right now, just mind his own business. Wasn't bothering nobody, just do my own thing. And all of a sudden, all the other ones started coming up to him and calling him the bully and started saying things about him. Maybe threw a rock at him. And he just kind of minded his own business. All of a sudden, it's kind of like, whoa, wait a minute. I'm doing mine and I'm fine. But now you guys are instigating me. You guys are the ones calling me out to problems. And he finally said, okay, fine. I'm the bully. I'm going to play the bully now. But I think that we too often we almost oversimplify. So it's just him being difficult. No, it wasn't. It was the fact that we made agreements with them beforehand, and we're basically trying to now go against those agreements with NATO and go into Ukraine. And we kind of started pushing that a little bit on our side, and so we kind of poked the bully a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there was a little bit of poking, but the United States told Ukraine, "Give up your nuclear weapons, and we'll help you out." Also, I would point to history itself. Nobody from the Western European conglomerate or America can push past the Kursk region because of the Russian winter. You cannot do that. The Russians, in World War II, the Russians literally had factories within distance of the front line that rolled off tanks that were with crews that just got in the tanks, and they were within the battle in 24 hours. The Russian Empire has never been defeated, minus the Mongols, who pretty much bow and arrowed on pony back everybody who actually resisted them as far as they could go, and that was solely based on logistics. So the Russian Empire, Russians in general, have never been truly been defeated. And I don't, for me, Vladimir Putin was born and raised a communist. He was a KGB agent. He grew up under communism. And if you have, I'm not saying that he doesn't have a legitimate beef, but the fact of the matter is anybody who stood in his way has died. And that is not the mark of a good man or a man who is defending himself, because you don't have to resort to violence to necessarily defend yourself against a political opponent, which he has done at every turn throughout his political career. I see Eric. You're
I guess I would just say though, like at this level, you're never going to be dealing with angels, right?
No.
You're never going to be dealing with moral people. Like it's like the worst always rise to the top in governmental systems, right? These are systems that self-select for people who are capable of being ruthless and like stepping over their mothers, like stepping on the backs of their mothers to gain power. And so, like, I'm no defender of Vladimir Putin in the sense that I was no defender. I would be no defender of like Saddam Hussein, but like, is it in America's interest to like get involved in a fight in these areas? And the thing to understand about Vladimir Putin is in the context of like Russia and Russian politics. Like Vladimir Putin may be a monster, but he was like one of the most pro-Western monsters we could ask for out of Russia. Because if you look at where he is in the context of like where the Overton window is of sentiments in Russia, like he is very much like a moderate compared to a lot of the factions in Russia, which would have invaded Ukraine a long time ago and started a war with us a long time ago as all this NATO expansion has been going on. Instead, Vladimir Putin has been over the decades like, he's the guy who called George W. Bush on the first phone call that he got after the 9/11 Twin Tower attacks, where from a foreign leader was from Vladimir Putin saying, you know what, we're with you. They went and they toured Texas high schools together. They I don't know. Maybe the cynic in me thinks that maybe he was, what's the old saying, when an enemy's about to make a mistake, get out of their way. Maybe that was it. He's like, you guys are about to go in the graveyard of empires, you idiots, right? Maybe that was it. But this is also the guy like who had offered to have Russia join NATO at one point. Like there were real opportunities to try to like enter a new era of some kind of stable peace with Russia. Not to say that like Russia was going to become like some freedom loving, like bastion of American style, constitutionalism. I'm not so naive to believe that that's ever going to happen. But, we do our government does tend to work with a lot of really nasty people. I mean, look at the the Saudis, right? We don't have any problem, forming alliances for the purposes of our foreign interests with terrible despots.
Corporate interest.
Yeah,
that's all it is. It's 100% corporate interest,
right?
Because the Saudis own so much of America, it's ridiculous. The Saudis could bankrupt America pulling out their investments, and that's the oligarchy that Russia. The reason Russia has not defeated Ukraine is simply because of the corruption that goes on in Russia. If the United States had undertook an endeavor such as invading Ukraine, it would have been done minus insurgency within 3 to 6 months. The fact that Russia, the second largest military or the third largest military, second or third largest military in the world, could not overcome Ukrainian resistance is a testament to the corruption of the Russian system. I mean,
what does it mean though to overcome Ukrainian resistance? Because I mean, I guess certainly like they didn't like topple it in a day, but like they're clearly winning the war.
Well, I will say this because like I tell everybody, I'm a bit of an amateur historian. Russia's initial invasion was such a clusterfuck of effery. When they're coming down well-established roads where the Ukrainian javelineers, the United States provided javelins, were just destroying Russian tank columns with impunity. Russia is a mighty force, and they've always been a mighty force. But the tactics employed by the Russians were primitive because the United States has literally been training the Ukrainians since the Obama administration. There's been the United States.
Yeah, since we overthrew their government.
Yeah.
10 years ago.
And that was directly because the United States promised the Ukrainians, if you give up your nuclear weapons, will help you out. You know, I don't think Russia would have invaded Ukraine if Ukraine had tactical nuclear weapons that they relinquished at the behest of the United States government. And I'm not a Putin apologist or Ukrainian or a Zelensky apologist, but I just don't think Russia faced that much of a threat from Ukraine with at the point prior to 2014. They didn't have a military force that could resist the Russians. It wasn't until they just demonstrated aggression towards Ukraine where Ukraine asked the U.S. to help them out with training their troops. I see you looking up again.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they asked. I mean, did they ask? I mean,
Yeah,
I guess what does that ask? What does that ask look like? I mean, because at least from what I understand, it is 2014. You had an elected president of Ukraine who was fairly elected by the people, who was involved in negotiations with both the EU and with Russia on trying to have trade agreements with both. He went to formalize the trade agreements with this was Yanukovych. He went to formalize the trade agreements with the European Union. He got there and he found that the European Union was now demanding that as a condition of the trade agreement, he could have no trade agreement with Russia. They were making it so he said he showed up to this like he was like a bride showing up to a wedding, discovering there was a never before discussed prenuptial agreement. He wasn't in the mood anymore, so he walked away. And then our government went over there and aided protest movements in overthrowing that government and installing our own puppet regime there to turn Ukraine into our vassal state. So I don't see like the government of Ukraine as really being an independent actor in any of this. They've been our proxy, and I feel bad for Vladimir Zelensky, because he's been like caught in the middle of this. I mean, he came in as someone who was trying to initially wanted to engage in peace relations with Russia and diffuse the situation, but he had like the far right Azov battalion folks like with a gun pointed at his head, like saying, if you try to normalize relations with Russia, we will kill you. And that's like a actually legitimate threat in Ukraine. It's not like some like, for all the talk of like neo-Nazis in America who have no political power and are like on the fringes of society. It's not like that in Ukraine. Now, if our government had like said, had backed him up on like on those of the negotiations, maybe we would be living in a very different world right now. But instead, our government like basically wanted to was willing to use kind of these Nazi groups in order to try to yank Ukraine further into our orbit. And I think that it was who was it who said for Ukraine to exist as like an independent country, like it can't be totally in the orbit of the West, and it can't be totally in the orbit of Russia. It's got to be like a neutral zone. It's got to be a space that can work with both. But I can't speak so much for what the Russians want, but I know that what our government has done has been the same kind of clandestine operations we've seen them doing my entire life. And
so let me ask you this: if you lived under the Iron Curtain, and that was effectively from about 1942, 1943, as far as the Ukrainians, actually going back to the Russian Revolution, as far as the Ukrainians, do you think they should have, they would embrace Russians after the historical significance of what Russia has done to the Ukrainian people? Because they're two distinct peoples. There's no difference than like the Ukrainians versus the Chechens and Russia. They're all the Eurasian countries right there, and the Slavic countries, the Yugos, Ukraine, to a certain extent Poland, all the Baltic countries. All of these countries have been under the Russian yoke, and it has not been good for them as far as the non-aggression principle, as well as the fact that these are distinct, separate people that didn't have their free will because they were under the subject of the Russian Empire. I don't think that there would be a negative discourse between the Ukrainians.
I mean, of course there would be. There's and look, I mean, I'm familiar with at least some of the terrible history there. I mean, certainly the Holodomor and like what the Soviets did in terms of the intentional starving of many of the people in Ukraine and the trying to move in ethnic Russians to make the territory of Ukraine more controllable. Like, there's terrible atrocities that have been committed there. The Soviets were awful. But ultimately, there's also practical reality, and the practical reality is that like you've got to find some kind of stasis and way to live with your neighbors without counting on America to just be the big bully in your back pocket who's going to be there to defend you. Because at the end of the day, like for America, like we actually like for all like the fear mongering that always kind of goes on about all these threats that we face all the time, we're actually like we live in like one of the safest, like most secure places in the entire world. Like there is no real foreign threat that we face that is not like a consequence of like blowback from our own like actions overseas. But like we are in Fortress America. The only real threat that we face that could really wipe us off the face of the map and wipe the whole world off the face of the map is nuclear war. And there's only a few ways that happens. And one of those ways is getting into a direct conflict with Russia. They still have the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world. I think they're even bigger than ours. And though at a certain point, it doesn't matter how big they are. Like as they start going off and so
a few hundred is
right. So understanding that, like it would have been far better for the people of Ukraine if we had not floated out bringing them into NATO, because we know that the Russians view that as a threat, the same way that we viewed the Cuban Missile Crisis as a threat. And
absolutely.
Anyway.
No, I will say this: tactical nuclear weapons are far more dangerous than strategic. And with that, I will hand it off to Tub.
Okay, so real quick then, and we'll get ready to wrap this up because we're at an hour 42 already now. So here's the thing: the way I've said this to people, they're kind of like they're not really tracking it so well, and I'm not saying I'm keeping up with all of it, but the idea I tell somebody, I said, listen, you have to understand that when this is said and done between Russia and Ukraine, so think of two guys out in the parking lot at the bar, and they're fixing to fight each other. And the one guy's just getting beat up on, and some guy standing on the side says, "Here, take this knife," and they take the knife and he cuts the guy. Fight's over now. I'm going to go, here's what's going to happen. When that's all said and done, the guy who got cut by the borrowed knife, he's going to look for the guy who gave him that knife. Like, dude, why'd you get involved in this? And let's be honest, right now in that fight, that's us. We are the guy who gave the other guy the knife in the fight.
Right. Well, and it's even worse than that, right? We are the guy who is telling the guy, you got this. Go. You stand up to him. I know he's like 4 times bigger than you, but you got this. We got your back, but we're not really in that fight. We are selling them on going and doing the fighting for us, right? Picking this fight, and in a literal sense, like our government has picked this fight with Russia and has been throwing Ukrainian people into the meat grinder, and they've openly talked about how great it is that no American lives are being lost. It's just Ukrainian lives that are being lost, and we get to kill a lot of Russians along the way. How great is that, right?
And I don't think the Ukrainians feel that way about it. I don't think they're sitting back going, "Hey, it's our lives, but we're risking ours. We're fine. Nobody's fine in this. Nobody's fine." So, but what you're saying though is, "Hey, it's not us. It's not us. So we're okay. We're not okay. It's not that easy." But here's what I think. I'm gonna be done with this part of it. Is what people don't understand, and there's a certain level that comes with being the president also. Foreign policy is not easy. It's just not. People think we can just go do this or we can just go do that. No, you can't. There are so many things that factor into foreign policy that you can't just proactively go out and do something just because you feel a certain way. It takes a lot more than that.
It certainly is. I would say that like one of the most basic things I think it requires, though, on a base level, is like a willingness to like talk to people,
to talk,
right, and that is not something that the current kind of neoconservative, neoliberal consensus is willing to do. And Trump, for all of his faults, is at least willing to talk to people. And sometimes blunder his way through things that makes me really concerned. But also sometimes in ways that create happy accidents. Like,
listen, when he crossed over into North Korea, I wasn't sitting here angry. I'm like, hey, go have the conversation.
Yeah. And then he brought John Bolton with him, who fucked the whole thing up.
Right. All right. So here's what I'm going to do, because we're at an hour 45.
Yeah.
So I got one very lighthearted question for you, and I am done. Okay. Now, if you could choose one person to come into the Free State Project, move up there and kind of really make a change, and you think that would draw people to you, who would that person be?
It has to be me.
No, I said it was a real libertarian.
Well, if Javier Milei would just give up the presidency and come and move to New Hampshire, he'd finally be a real libertarian.
How about an American?
Who's one? I don't know. Who's one person? Justin Amash just lost his race for U.S. Senate, right? He could come and be the next U.S. Senator for New Hampshire, or I know our friend Larry Sharp in New York has run for governor a few times. It's hard to win in the least free state in America. New Hampshire's not too far away. He could come up. He could be running for governor of New Hampshire. He could become governor of New Hampshire.
Yep.
He's a talent. We'd love to have him. I don't know. I could list off a lot of names.
Okay.
But ultimately, I would say the quality of the people we want people who are coming to build things. People who are, we have a saying, build, don't bitch. Right. A lot of people, and we see this a lot in the liberty movement. Or I guess this is true around politics all over the place. There's a lot of people who like to sit around and bitch about what other people are doing and how they're not doing it right. But meanwhile, it's like, okay, what are you doing? If you have a better way to go do something, go out and do it and build it. Right. We want people who have that attitude of they're coming to build something, not to sit around complaining about how other people are doing it wrong.
I tell people all the time, you can't complain and do nothing. Complain all you want, but do something. Back it up with some actions. And that's actually what got me to run for city council. I realized I was doing a lot of complaining and a lot of nothing else. And I said, all right, it's time for me to do something.
Awesome.
All right. I'm done. My side is
complaining
done.
without doing anything is bitching. I'm going to give Eric his closing statements, how to contact you, what you're doing, and whatnot. And go ahead and deliver that to the people as we close this up.
All right. You can follow me on Twitter at Senator Brakey. You can follow the Free State Project at Free State NH. I would strongly encourage you, go to our website, fsp.org, sign up for our newsletter to get updates on what's happening and see every month, like the things that we're building in New Hampshire. You don't have to move to New Hampshire, but if you are a libertarian, you owe it to yourself to at least come and visit and explore and see what's being built here. And great opportunities for that are the Porcupine Freedom Festival in June at porkfest.com, pork with a C for porcupine. You can learn more about it there. We also have the New Hampshire Liberty Forum in April, nhlibertyforum.com. Tickets on sale for all of those right now. We'd love to have you come visit New Hampshire. And any time of year, really, there's a great place called the Independence Inn, which is owned and operated by Free Staters, where you could, it's kind of centrally located, like an hour drive to so many different Free State communities in New Hampshire. You could come any time of year for a porcupine vacation, experience what it would be like to be a porcupine with us in the Free State, even if just for a week. Come on out. We'd love to have you. And I hope everyone in California recovers all right from this and stays safe. And I will say, if you are a libertarian in California who finds yourself in a situation where you need to look for a new place to live, come check out New Hampshire.
Well, Tub, you have nothing else?
I'm good.
I want to thank everybody who watched, listened, and participated in this podcast. We are truly only here to bring you the message of liberty. And me being the only real libertarian, regardless
Yep.
of what
Covered
these neo-European individuals came at us with. And when I say us, I'm a multiple, there's a lot of dimensions to me.
There's a lot of you in there. Yes.
There's a lot of me. And even though they hated on me for being the only real libertarian here, all the way in New Hampshire, I want to thank Eric because he's 3 hours ahead of me. I want to thank you very much. Shut up, Tub. I want to thank you very much for participating because you are inspirational individual to me because I feel you're doing things for the right reasons. And if you call yourself a libertarian, if you're not doing things for the right reasons, call yourself a Democrat or a Republican. And I'm going to say something that I hope offends a lot of Americans right now. I think Americans are stupid for going for the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. The only way we're going to move this country forward is by some uncomfortable truths. And those truths are the duopoly and the uniparty do not care about your individual liberty. There are too many people in both of those parties that care about their personal beliefs more than your personal lifestyle. You should be able to live the way you want to live as long as you're not doing anything wrong to others. And be offended, but be vigilant, because the only person you can protect is you. You are your own first responder, and the only person or persons you're responsible for are you and your family. I have lesbian neighbors that live right behind me. They did not affect me raising my kids in any way, shape, or form because I made sure I raised my kids the way I believe. Whether you live in an urban society, suburban society, or rural society, at the end of the day, you are responsible for your kids and how they proceed forward in this world. If you believe, like I believe, in the individualism of every American, then you will raise your kids as an individual American according to your belief system, and you will not let anybody outside of that affect your reasoning or your approach to raising your kids, whether you're a homesteader or living in a 1,000 person per acre dense area in an urban society. You are responsible for you and yours. So at the end of the day, I want to tell you this. This is the Black Powder Podcast, the only real libertarian podcast hosted by the only real libertarian, myself, Marcus Matthews. And then we have my guy Tub, and Eric had to break out because he had things to take care of. I want to thank Eric Brakey. You're one of my favorite guests ever. That's why I wanted to make sure we had you home before then, 1 year before you came on before. As the great state of New Hampshire says in their state seal and their official motto, live free or die.
Or die.
Thank you, Eric. And thank you, America. God bless the USA, and let's do this.